took an age to write The Mapmaker's Daughter. Okay. Um, can we get the first image on the PowerPoint? I'm sorry? Come closer to the mic. Oh, okay. No, back one. There we go. Okay, let me know if you can't hear me, okay? It took an age to write The Mapmaker's Daughter, my first novel. And I can report from where I stand today, here, more than 20 years after I embarked on the book, that late blooming is to blooming as the new 70 is to 70. And that's good, because the point isn't when, the point is what and how. This is the understatement of my entire life. I am very glad you're here today. To hear about who the Mapmaker's Daughter was, really, and who she became to me. I want to tell you what happened. Over the decades of researching and writing, and spoiler alert, getting my book published, not even a handful of people knew I was working on it, dreaming about it, getting crushed and uplifted by it, often in the same hour. So when the book came out, I did too. And not just to others. For years, I had hidden from my own ability behind a shield of artistic deference. All at once, I was disclosed, and by a work of fiction, no less. The idea for this undertaking wasn't mine. There we go. I went to college late, and as an older student at Princeton, I made friends with many of my teachers, none more important to me than the historian Bernard Lewis. He died not all that long ago, but back in 1997, when he was 82 and I was middle-aged, he told me of an improbably influential woman in the 16th century Ottoman dynasty. She had risen to the height of power, but almost nothing was known about her. Her name was Nurbanu. Bernard pointed out this is the same name as mine, which I actually knew because Nouri means light in both Arabic and Turkish. You should write her story, he instructed me. I pointed out I'd never written fiction, and I reminded him that I was no scholar of Ottoman history, and he told me that neither of those things mattered. And then he explained why, because he said we were going to write this book together. And when I asked him how we were going to do that, where is he? Well, you know, I keep losing the image that's here. I want to get back. Can we get, I seem to be a little out of sync here. How can I go backwards? I'd like to just get Bernard's face back there, because he's not wearing his glasses there, but he was an extremely commanding figure. And he had on his glasses, and he took them off when I said, how are we going to do this together? And he said, trust me, which it was typical for me that I just did. The Mapmaker's Daughter is a story about trust. It is about a bond between two people, a 12-year-old Venetian girl and the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. It's a bond that is respected by one of them and manipulated by the other. Nurbanu's own story starts with her patrician and, importantly, her illegitimate birth and upbringing in Venice, her abduction at 12 by the admiral of the Ottoman fleet, and most importantly, her appeal to the Sultan, Suleiman the Magnificent, and his to her. Suleiman. They are captivated by each other. He by the breadth of her education, she by his authority. And I will just point out it was more his authority to her than his power, and his power was colossal. We can come back to that if you like. But more than captivated, they need each other. And much as this girl needs that sultan, as we'll see, he needs her more. Assuring that your will is carried out when you're dead has its problems. It requires a person or a law or both. The Law of Fratricide was already on the books when Suleiman came to power. Its purpose was to ensure that one person accede to the throne without a contest afterwards. Its purpose, in other words, was to avoid civil war. That law is the axis around which the Mapmaker's Daughter turns. Suleiman assigned Nurbanu to the son he intended to have succeed him. That's against Suleiman. Selim II. This is Nurbanu's husband. And I'll just digress for a second and say that the reason Suleiman chose him to succeed him was because he was his weakest son. More about that later, if you like. And Nurbanu bore for Selim a son. That's really all that mattered, was bearing a son, and that's Murad III. And this is the prince, the grandson of Suleiman, whom Suleiman wanted to have succeed him. This relationship between Nurbanu and between Suleiman and Nurbanu as the mother of that favored grandson is the key to all that happened afterwards, and that he was trusting her to carry out his will after he was gone. If fratricide is the axis of the story, that relationship is its tilt. It accounts throughout the memoir for the light, often oblique, that is shed on Nurbanu's understanding of herself. It accounts for the darkness she keeps encountering in her memory. Ultimately, it explains how her need to be legitimate caused her to think and to feel and to choose horribly. Nurbanu knows this, or she suspects it, when, on her deathbed, she sets out to understand what has made her do the things she has done over the course of a long and very consequential life. Her confession, her inquiry, belongs as much to the girl she was as to the woman she becomes. It also belongs to me, to who I was when I set out on this and to who I have become. Bernard gave me a really big syllabus. It took 1.5 years to read, and it gave rise to the many timelines and genealogies and charts that I created and pinned to a bulletin board, which was about the size of Central Asia, over the top of my desk. As I've been rummaging through my files recently, exhuming all of these visual aids, I've appreciated more than ever how important they were, especially when it came time to write. Sure, they kept me straight on a huge number of details, but just as importantly, they calmed me down. Many times when I closed my eyes in fear of not finding a next sentence, I would remind myself to look up, and there alongside the maps of the empire and the rest of the known world were my other allies, the facts. In 2001, I set about finding Nurbanu in every place she might have lived or visited. I want to emphasize that very little was known about Nurbanu. I think I said that in the beginning, but this is really key to how I think an historical novel works itself out. As her interpreter, I needed to see what she had seen day in and day out. If there were a chance of also seeing what might have struck awe in her, what might have scared her stiff, I needed to see that too. This meant weeks in Venice, it meant many weeks on the island of Paros in the Cyclades, and it meant several seasons in Turkey. In Istanbul, of course, but also up and down the coast and way out into Anatolia. Having no reason to doubt that history and my research would serve as the fixed tracks upon which Nurbanu would power the story forth, I began to write. It always struck me as overboard that parents measure a 2-year-old's age in months until I finished the first draft, which took 22. I gave the rubber-banded 500 pages to Bernard, who, without looking at it, said, "Good, I look forward to reading this. Now write the next one." And when I asked about his part was when he let me know that I was going to write this book by myself, which he had known all along. This did not mean that his official withdrawal didn't throw me. I believe I knew even then that the tome that I had handed in was really just a dressed-up chronology. That it didn't have an arc was the least of what it lacked. It didn't have a point. And it put zero flesh on a protagonist whose known identity was skeletal. So I returned to Istanbul to get my bearings, and the first place I went was Nurbanu's mosque, which I urge any of you who are thinking of going to Istanbul to see. I had visited it once 3 years earlier on my first trip to Istanbul, or I had tried to. On that first visit, the taxi driver had actually sworn that no such place had existed, which was really weird given how important this place is. When I climbed out at the address, I could see why he thought so, because the place either was or certainly seemed to be abandoned. Every structure, this is an entire complex, this is common with mosques, a whole complex of kind of beneficent buildings. 3 schools, library, hospital, baths, a dervish convent, and the so-called guest house for those who just might be dying were locked tight. The only sounds were from the birds in the remains of a linden tree by the ablution fountain. Lindens live for hundreds of years. They're like olive trees. And as I stood next to that trunk, where'd it go? As I stood next to it, that was the first time I had a feeling that I would have after, not often, but it was the first time I had the feeling that I was there with her, and not that she was there beside me, but that I was somehow there in her time. That tree really made me, that she might have planted it, made me feel that I was in her moment. When I returned 3 years later, knowing I was writing this book by myself, the taxi knew just where the mosque was, and the compound was not only open, as you can see, it was blooming and thriving. I have no explanation for this, by the way. It's just one of those things that I think is, providence. And at the heart of it was and is a mosque that is recognized as the gem in the crown of Sinan, who was the greatest architect that the empire ever had. Take a look at this. This is the dome. And the clear story around it. Version 2 of the book was less self-conscious, a lot leaner, and took half the time to write. A serious publisher was taken by it and suggested restructuring it in ways that she was kind enough to spell out. Better, she said a few months later. Still needs a story, though. Well, her life is the story, I muttered to myself. Well, actually, no, it wasn't. So that draft was history, too. And I was beginning to see that the very thing that made Nurbanu a good subject for fiction, her being nearly a blank slate, was what was making it so hard to find or to imagine a story. And so I began to pursue tangents off of Nurbanu's biography in the hope of finding that unidentified mother-lode thing that had really occurred and that would somehow yield the tale. The case of the Istanbul Observatory is an example. When it opened in 1577, this is a real, true thing, and this is the only image we have of it for a reason you'll find out. It was the most sophisticated observatory in the world. 3 years after it went up, it was demolished deliberately. A lot has been written about the observatory and what happened to it and why, but apparently nothing definitive. This seemed like a real opening to a real story. I read everything I could on the subject. I talked to Bernard about it, and then to find out conclusively, he sent me to Turkey again to see his friend Ekmelettin İhsanoğlu. No one knows more about the observatory than he does. Ekmelettin is known to many as the presidential candidate who came in second behind Erdogan in 2014. But when I saw him, he was the head of the Department of History of Science at Istanbul University. And no one anywhere knows more than he does. And what he said to me at the end of a full and unforgettable day on his campus was that no one can say for sure who destroyed the observatory or why. And I said, do you mean that I can make this up? He said, yes, you can make it up. Well, this was great news, and I knew that the version that followed was better than the last because, among other things, it forced me to rethink important relationships and to learn how much, or rather how little, technical information a fictional narrative can support. But the story of the observatory, which does remain in the finished work, for all of its scientific importance and juicy and germane implications, was too far removed from Nurbanu's self to supply the story. And so a word here about historical fiction. Now, maybe I'm kidding myself, but I really think that if I had understood that the term's operative word was fiction and not history, I wouldn't have kept thinking that the facts would yield up a plot. The facts are merely the warp on the loom. I had to invent the weft. And my obsession with details, their numbers and accuracy, was totally hobbling me. What was needed was plain old verisimilitude. Not that that's a piece of cake, but at least I knew enough to beware of its arch enemy, anachronism. And the way I did that was by making sure that there is not a word in this novel that wasn't in use in 1582. When she died. And all I needed for that was an OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, or as my husband liked to call it, the QE2. I embarked on version 3, and I'm happy to tell you that something unanticipated accompanied the feeling of being almost sickeningly out there. And it was the feeling that Nurbanu was out there too, and that she needed me. I understood, and this is no euphemism, that I was responsible for her. Frankly, I think I might have understood that all along. It's probably why I wrote in the first person. I always knew that she would speak better for herself. I was just writing on her behalf. And I'm just going to say here, when I was going through my files the other day, I was really surprised to see that in my outlines, when I refer to her, I say I, and so okay, a little bit of a mind meld. A valuable dividend of this approach was discovering that Nurbanu, in her realness, didn't remember everything any more than I, the writer, could imagine everything. So the trick was to line up what I couldn't imagine with what she couldn't remember. The most technically difficult rewrite, and there had been several by this time, followed the counsel of yet another editor who loved the book, except for one thing, the structure. Weaving the backstory into every chapter was fiendishly hard to do. It took forever, and it made the book much better. The editor read it with care and appreciation, and still no dice. When I was invited to this festival, I was told that listeners might be interested in my writing process. I thought, process, are you kidding? My process was following suggestions from smart editors who kept turning down the book. Now, not all of these were rejected by people who were not me, but a lot of them were. And at this point, I will say that it is extremely easy to take failure for inadequacy, especially in oneself. At that point, I could not see how else to take it. I really couldn't, I mean, we're talking now like 12 years into this. I couldn't bear to keep failing in that way. I love to write. But it was getting to the point where I literally could not imagine how to rewrite this book again. I thought I didn't have it in me. Mark Twain had advice for writers who were at the juncture that I was at. Write without pay until someone offers pay. If nobody offers within 3 years, you may look upon that as a sign that sawing wood is what you're intended for. Well, 3 years, I was like past 12. And so in that very daunted state, I went back to the woodpile, otherwise known as the Encyclopedia of Islam. I dragged myself over to Firestone Library, Princeton's main library, and I reread all of the relevant entries, including on Suleiman, his father, his son, his grandson. And then I found it, the unburied key. Right on the page that I had read easily 10 times before. It is the entry on Murad III, Nurbanu's son. And it says, let's get him back here so you can see him. that when he took the throne, a crucial and ghastly decision to carry out the law of fratricide, that is, to execute 5 young princes, was made against his will. What it doesn't say is who made that decision, or why, or with what effect. There it was, the story. All I had to do then was write it. From that moment on, my responsibility for Nurbanu became a shared purpose. She and I were looking for the same thing, and we would conduct our searches by the same means. We would, very carefully, look at what had happened to her from the time of her earliest memory, and we would do our best to make sense of it. From that point on, just like her, as she wrote her confession, I began to see. I was 60 when I embarked on that version, and finally I knew where I was heading. The story that followed was written with a confidence and therefore an energy that I had never experienced. The fact that I knew how much better the book wasn't why the next rejection was so hard. In fact, that one was in a class by itself, and it did more than cut to the bone. It went at my heart by means of my blood. Now, legitimacy is one of the toughest nuts that Nurbanu has to crack. In the story, being illegitimate is what makes her loathe her father, which matters very much, because from the day she lays eyes on Suleiman till the day she draws her last breath, she regards him, Suleiman, as the font of her legitimacy. She knows, and finally, over the days of writing her life down, she can acknowledge that her consuming need to be legitimate is what caused her to take leave of herself when she ordered the execution of 5 princes, young ones. She didn't fail to note that long before she gave that ghastly order, she had actually been made legitimate by her imperial marriage, which is to say that legitimacy is tricky, for it's both a fact and a feeling, and the feeling matters more. Nurbanu knew this, and I do too. In the introduction to the book, I mention my father, that getting into the story allowed me to learn about him. Only then did he tell me the details of his father's murder in front of his whole family in Baghdad when my father was 12 in 1930. When he came to America in 1938, never to return to Iraq, my father's first goal was to get a degree, which he never did. And that was why he was obsessed with my getting one. He wanted for me and for himself through me that legitimacy. I wanted it too, very much, though my desire for a degree turned out to be nothing compared to the desire to get my book published. I was determined to get that credential, that thing that makes a person believable, officially, if only because this book could be seen as an extension and an expression of my education. I was certain my father would be interested in it, until I gave him a draft to read. He held it up, like he was weighing it. He tapped it with a finger and he put it down. He did not say a word, nor did he ever read it. And I could only conclude, and still conclude, that I had come too close to his past. Which is a real thing. This was when I stopped writing. I surrender, I told my husband. Oh, I love Rose. It's okay. I surrender, I told my husband. That's okay, he said. Surrendering isn't quitting. This was a perfect example of Robert always being ahead of me while having my back. So here's Robert. This is on the Bosporus. It's only been in preparing these remarks that I've considered why my father's rejection is the one that brought me to a halt. I've been my own toughest judge all my life, but I'd never seen that behavior as a pretext for allowing the views and the feelings, even the ancient wounds of others, to determine my self-regard, especially as a writer. Only now do I see that my father's blows the one he suffered and the one he landed on me, were too big to pretend about. Very slowly, over months of not writing, I began to see. I saw that I'd been confusing the need to change something, the book, with the imperative to change someone. Listening carefully to all of those publishers' helpful, important suggestions was no substitute for listening to myself and for myself. I have known since an early age that to love is to be vulnerable and worth it. I didn't know until I was old how similar that is to writing fiction. There is no point in doing it unless you are in it, really in and really you. I started over. The rewrite prescribed and enforced by me, and as soon as I began, I heard Nurbanu change. I didn't decide this. She came back to me, and she sounded different. She sounded like somebody who knew dread and vulnerability and the beginning of acceptance. She sounded like me. What followed then was a rewriting that, among other things, yielded a new plot in which love and death are forms of illumination. It also brought me the publisher of my dreams. The Mapmaker's Daughter was conceived as an end-of-life memoir, so there had always been two narrative arcs, the long one of her life and the short one of the deathbed days when she's recalling her life. But it wasn't until I started over that I understood that those arcs, that their points of friction could move the wheels of Nurbanu's conscience. And that is what allows her to see the truth, and over the days that are left to her, to tell the truth. Every day of her decline, her voice is more audible. Her words are more legible. She is making a map. This draws me, finally, to the third arc, the arc of my own life, because of what I have come to know over these years, especially about loss of life and of illusion. I am able to lead Nurbanu to apply what she has come to know in hers. When the first copy of the book arrived in the mail, I took it out of the envelope with obstetric care. I stared at the purple cover with Nurbanu's face, and I was aware I was feeling something I had never felt before. I was proud. And it wasn't of the book. It was of myself. And I was certain that every season of what had gone into what I was feeling and holding there in my hands had been necessary for it. I haven't looked at the world in the same way since. When I was 44, I wasn't married. I hadn't dreamed of writing a novel. I wasn't a grandmother. Now I'm on Medicare. My grandson is in business school. My husband has died, and I am here with you. I am on a steep learning curve. Sometimes it planes off. Sometimes it planes off. I take a deep breath. I marvel at the new views. But what I look forward to more is the return of the climb. I'm serious about this. After all, when we're young, we have the advantage of thinking we'll live forever. But when we're older, we have the advantage of knowing we won't. No matter what, my life and I are going to keep changing. I know this. Changing not only doesn't threaten who I am, it is freeing me to be who I am. And to the degree that I can see it for what it is and enjoy it while it's happening, I'm going to try to do that too. Thank you so much for being here. Yeah. I'm getting a signal here. Yeah. So I'm very happy to take questions, very happy. And we've got 15 minutes for that if you'd like. Thanks. And I want to say that they actually sold out of the book, so if you would like it, I have cards that I can give you that I can sign, and you can use them. So is there, yeah, yes.
So when did you start, Christina, and what were you majoring in? Were you looking at, history, Ottoman Empire?
Well, actually, I didn't start at Princeton until I was 28. I had my kids first. My kids are almost older than I am. So anyway, I majored in politics as an undergrad and Near Eastern Studies as a graduate student. But I did everything inside out. But I sort of focused on modern politics of the region. I literally didn't know anything about the Ottoman Empire. But that's when I knew him. And because I was older, I had this, I was really lucky. I mean, I wasn't, creaky old, but I was old enough so that I made friends with my professors. And that's how this came about. I started the book when I was 47. Oh, what happened then? Oh, I had some jobs. There's some people in this room who've known me forever. But the one that I did longest was, I was head of communications for a foundation, but I've been a speechwriter. I've been a ghostwriter. And I actually still am. So I'm sort of a ventriloquist.
I was just trying to get the connection. So when you were 44, was that when Bernard was still?
Yeah. He's been my friend since I was in my late 20s. So then, over dinner one night when I was 47, he said, he actually said, "You've been using somebody else's voice long enough." He was absolutely right. But it would not have dawned on me to write a novel. I didn't say one of the rejections, okay, this is the one that really threw me, was after one of the really big ones, I thought, okay, it's perfectly clear you don't know how to write fiction. You are just no good at this. So I thought about the guy that had written Memoirs of a Geisha, who got a lot of turndowns, and he had the same feeling. So he went to Columbia, for an MFA or something. You probably know him, Rose. And then he writes the book, and his life is perfect after that. So I thought, okay, I'm going to go to writing school. So I applied to the New School, which is a very good fiction writing program. I shouldn't be telling you this, but I prepared this huge application, and I didn't get on the waiting list. That's when I thought I was going to really commit hara-kiri. Okay. And any other questions? Yes.
What can you tell us about your father's background and the death of his father when he was 12?
No.
And how that prospered?
Well, my father, my entire paternal family is Iraqi and importantly Christian. They were Chaldean, which is very close to being Roman Catholic. And this is key to why he was actually assassinated in a case of mistaken identity. My grandfather was taken for his brother, who was the Minister of Finance. And a lot hasn't changed. Privileged minorities, in this case it was Jews and Christians in Iraq, were targets. But I think my father died not all that long ago, in his mid-90s. But I think it was absolutely key to who he was and how he went about his life, trying to very successfully assimilate himself as an American. But it's interesting. He wasn't. I know he only feigned uninterest in my book. I know that, but arg. Oh. Yes.
Were you given cooperation by the Muslim leadership in Turkey and the government leadership in Turkey?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question because that's not something that ever came up. Nobody suggested that I needed it. However, my book was acquired about 5 years ago by the largest publisher in Turkey. They acquired the right to it. They said they would translate it. I was advised by Orhan Pamuk's translator to hire my own translator if I wanted a decent translation. I did that. It was translated. I don't know if I told you this, Rose. And it was supposed to come out in May of 2017. It didn't come out. June happens. It gets to be July. And there's the coup attempt, remember? And in August, I got a note from the publisher saying they were canceling the book. Returned the little sum of money, and they said they were canceling it because of historical inaccuracy, which is of course ludicrous, simply because it was so vetted by Bernard Lewis. the history in it is accurate. But it was just a casualty, like all of the, the universities and schools that were purged of their faculty. This was reported, not by me, but to Penn International. But separately, Erdogan apparently really identifies with Suleiman. There's a series, a hugely successful series that's now on Netflix now, but it was all over the Muslim world and also Europe, called Magnificent Century, about Suleiman, and Nurbanu figures in it too, but in season 3 or something. And Erdogan had that canceled. It had 250 million viewers, and he had it canceled because he didn't like its representation of Suleiman. And I doubt he ever glimpsed my book, but somebody thought he wouldn't be entertained by my version of Suleiman. Yes?
I was impressed by how many bright women there were.
Yeah.
Besides the protagonist, but her mother, her aunt, the woman when she first came to the palace, etc.
Yes.
So was that something that you found in your research, that women were actually that educated or strong, or was it purposeful that you wanted to create that?
That's a great
Also, do you have another book?
Yeah, that's a great question, and the answer is both. Not all the time consciously, but clearly unconsciously, I wanted it to be about a powerful woman and a powerful girl. Actually, more importantly, because the girl is very important to the story. But it is also true that Venetian girls of the time, this would not have been true in the empire, but in Venice, where she came from, patrician Venetian girls were as well educated as their brothers were. And this is very important to the story. I ascribe this education to Cecilia as a girl, and I make this be the thing that makes her attractive to Suleiman, is specifically her education. I haven't a clue whether she had that education, but it is very plausible that she might have. The other women, the women in the harem, at particularly this period, this is when they rose to the height of their power. It was administrative power, but if you rose to her height, where she the real power kicked in when you're the mother of the sultan. These guys, they loved their mothers, and because she was Venetian, I mean, she had a lot of influence. There's so much to say about women in the harem. It wasn't all about sex. In fact, it mainly wasn't about sex. But the other people in the harem that had a lot of power were the agents, and they were invariably Jewish women, and they had come from, after the expulsion from Spain, so they'd made their way, up through to Antwerp and across the Alps and over to Venice. I mean, this is the route they traveled, and they were welcomed in the Ottoman Empire. I don't know how well known this is. This is why all of the palace physicians were Jews. The bankers were Jews. The printers were Jews. In this way, the Ottomans were, really enlightened. They knew that they were importing serious talent. Do I have another book? I do, and it's absolutely nothing like, it's set in the present day, but it's what it has in common is that it's about a strong girl. I don't think I'm going to pretend I don't know it yet. That's okay. So anything else I could comment?
Is it hard for you to speak in a situation like this?
No, it makes me so happy. This is the dream I didn't dare dream, to be able to look at people who are interested in something that means so much to me. It makes me. The only thing that makes me nervous is somebody's going to ask me a question like about the Battle of Lepanto or Charles V, and I knew it, but I'm freezing. Fratricide? Yeah, that's very important to the history of the Ottoman Empire. It was promulgated in 1453 by Mehmed the Conqueror, who was Suleiman's great-grandfather. And its purpose, as I said, was to avoid civil war. It wasn't always observed, but more often than not. It fell into disuse one generation after Nurbanu, and that is because this is a fact, that the execution in the capital of the little boys and the spectacle of Selim's funeral, the cortege with these 5 little coffins, really freaked people out. They knew that it had happened in the provinces up until then, but it also didn't involve murdering children, sort of block or whatever. It was brothers duking it out in the provinces. So when it happened in the capital, it was so offensive. In case anybody's wondering, was this a heartless people? The answer is no. I mean, they really didn't like it. So after it lapsed in the very early 17th century, what they did to avoid civil war is they incarcerated the princes their whole lives in Topkapi Palace. It was just a freak show. And this is, historians say that this is the beginning of the decline of the empire. So it's a very, and if you're really interested in this, there's a fantastic scholarly book, but it's readable, called The Imperial Harem by Leslie Pierce. It's a slog, but it has the answer to every question you might have on this subject. Yes. Yeah, well, my father was from Baghdad. My mother was Irish American. They met during the war. This is amazing. I don't know if you know. I think it's still true. Maybe my friend over here, George Karshman, knows. But that foreign nationals can serve in the U.S. Army. And my father, as an Iraqi national, was in the U.S. Army during the war, and he was on leave in Washington. And they met at a motel swimming pool, and they got married 3 weeks later. I mean, it was a pyrotechnical relationship that lasted till I was 17. Oh, yeah. I was going to say the Great War, but not that one. Oh, I'm 70. Yeah. No, I wasn't pretending when I. Oh well. Yeah. Now, in the next room is Ashton Applewhite, who lectured me for an hour yesterday on if somebody says you look good for your age, what is the right thing to say? Go take a hike. Well, you look good for yours too. And I said, can I just say thanks? I mean, yes. Well, I hope there will be one. I would say look to, it's called The Magnificent Century. You can get season 1 on Netflix. The people whom I've run into here who have seen it thought it was really cheesy. I didn't, because I was eating it with a spoon. I thought it was so interesting. The guy who plays Suleiman is fantastic. So it's a little soap opera, but it's not bad. And I cannot think of a movie. But I'm not kidding. I hope there will be one. All right. So I'll be out there with my little cards that I can sign, and you can put in the book you can order if you like. Thank you very much for coming.